welcome.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining today. Welcome. Today, I'm going to talk to you about content models and how they're the design tool you've never considered before. My name is Courtney Clark. I'm the VP of Design at Forum One. There's my contact information. I'd love to connect on LinkedIn, especially if you want to chat about content models later or other questions come up. At Forum One, I lead a talented team of 13 visual designers, user experience designers, researchers, illustrators, animators, really amazing team. My specialty is user experience design. So I've been conducting UX research and doing usability testing and wireframing and site mapping, all the stuff that comes with that for the last 15 years, and primarily with nonprofits, government, and foundations. I'd also like to give a shout out to my colleague, Julia Bradshaw. She contributed heavily to this presentation, and I'm thankful for her input here. In the chat, if you'd like to, I would love for you to share your name and location. Helps me get a sense of who you all are and where you might be located. It's up to you if you want to share that, though. DC, North Carolina, Maryland, Virginia, Colorado, Oregon. Wow, Germany, San Francisco, DC, Portland, Missouri, Massachusetts, Florida. Great. Thanks so much for sharing that. It's fun to see folks from all over joining. I'm located in Seattle, Washington. The sun is slowly trying to rise here, so thanks for putting up with my interesting lighting right now. I mentioned that I work for Forum One. We're a digital agency who works primarily with nonprofits. We've worked with over 1,000 organizations and done many, many, many projects. Our focus is really to create experiences that have an impact. And we do that for like I mentioned, nonprofits, foundations, and government. Here's a quick sample of the clients that we work with. One of the many reasons that I love working at Forum One is the amazing clients whose missions I get to support with the work that I do every day. Enough about me. Let's get to the topic at hand. Here's a quick agenda for what I plan to go through today and talk about content models and how they can be really helpful to designers. Before we dig in too far, I want to introduce some key players in this story and process. So our project teams are typically made up of this group of 5 emojis, 5 people. Typically, we have a project manager, a back-end developer, a UX designer, a front-end developer, and a visual designer. Sometimes our teams are a little bit smaller, sometimes they're bigger depending on the project, but these are the cast of characters involved in this process. And this is me, the UX designer. I'm telling this story from the perspective of the UX designer, and these are the common responsibilities that I have on a project. So everything from discovery activities where we're learning about the group's goals and audiences, additional research, the content inventory, the content model, that's an important one. And then finally, sitemap, wireframes, and prototyping. And along the way, there's tons of collaboration with that team. I'll be in backlog grooming sessions. I'll also be supporting the other designer on the project, even doing a little bit of QA. But a big part of my work as UX designer is creating those wireframes. And you know, they're simple black and white blueprints for various pages on the site. I present these to the internal team. I also present them to our client and get sign off. I'm making changes along the way. And eventually this is informing both what is visually designed when we add the look and feel, the colors and the images, but also what's built as we move into development. So this is where sometimes we hit some snags in the process. My primary role in the development phase is to be there to answer questions that the developers might have, especially around intended actions or interface elements. What's clickable, what's not? Where does this element pull information from? And this is totally reasonable. It's predictable to have these types of questions, and it's important to ensure that the team is developing the pages how we envision them, how the client envisioned them. So this is some of the common questions we get. The challenge really is, though, that we were facing is that sometimes those questions come months into the development phase. And at that point, I have already moved on probably to other projects. The wireframes are done, right? So I'm there to support, but I've got other things on my plate. And sometimes it can be difficult to carve time aside to recall what I'd planned, to like think back to wireframes I may have created 3, sometimes 6 months ago. And sometimes questions come up, and to be honest, like sometimes I didn't think about that question, or I didn't make a plan for it. And I have to come up with a solution pretty quick because I don't want to slow down the rest of my team in development. And all of that seemed very inefficient. It seemed like there was a lot of room for improvement. So after hitting these snags on a couple of projects, there are patterns that emerged, of course. And they were largely in the types of questions that developers were asking me. So they'd ask, do you really need 2 components that are nearly identical? Like maybe they had one piece that was different. Another common question is, okay, I see what you have on the page. Where does this piece pull from? Where are you getting this from? Another one is, how is this maintained? Is this populated? Is the content populated manually or dynamically? So sometimes these questions and notes were in JIRA tickets. Sometimes they were captured in the wireframe or the page design annotations. But generally, they were being captured like inconsistently. It varied from like project to project. And I knew that that was not a great approach, that we could save a lot of time in development if I had the answers quicker and was a little bit more prepared so that I could get answers, you know, down the road. So the challenge was, how do we get these answers earlier and prevent that sort of churn that's happening in the development stage? So enter my hypothesis and a couple things that I tried. My hypothesis was that if the designers front-loaded that work, answered those questions, documented common questions and answers in the design phase, that we would not only make developers' lives easier, but we'd save time. It would just benefit the whole project. And my mantra through this was always like, how do I make your job as a developer easier? What can I be providing? How do we make this smoother? Because I want that transition from discovery to design to deliver to be smooth as butter. So the first thing that I tried, the first prototype we'll call it, is documenting these questions and decisions in the design file. We use Sketch for our design files. Kind of good news, like it worked and it was helpful, but it was not very efficient. The challenge was that this was something that only I could edit. Like other people on the team could edit the file, but they had to like download it, you know, they had to be familiar with Sketch, get in there, make a note, save it, put it back on Drive or send it to the team or upload it to InVision. And that created a bottleneck. So not terribly efficient. So I went back to my trusty team and did a little research. I asked developers and technical architects and quality assurance folks, and even like other UX designers and visual designers. I asked them, where would it be most helpful to document this type of information? And the answer that I heard was document it in the place that's closest to implementation. Okay, so let's figure out where that is, right? Jira tickets, very close to implementation, but those often are created a little bit later. Like when I'm in design, maybe they're starting to be created, but they're not fully fleshed out. And we're writing acceptance criteria, yes, but those can sometimes be very point in time. And we needed a living document that could evolve over time and something that other team members could come back to and could edit. So we wanted something close to implementation. We also needed a living document. So I was looking at what we already had potentially that we could use. Drum roll, enter the content model. This document is something that in our process, the UX designer starts. They do the draft, they review it with the developer and certainly get lots of feedback and input. And then eventually review it with the client. There was a point where we handed off to the lead developer, the technical architect, and they then own it and maintain it as we move into implementation. So this seemed like the next place to try this out. So this was my second prototype. I added some more tabs to the content model and I asked for feedback along the way and iterated and kept asking, what's missing? What would help fill your needs better? So let's dive in. Let's talk about this content model. So in our process, we first do a content inventory and that helps us understand the depth and the breadth of all the content on the existing site. Now, of course, this only works if you have an existing site. This doesn't really work for brand new sites, the inventory. So after we do the inventory and we've done the audit and we know what we're keeping, what we're removing, and what needs to be removed or rewritten, the UX designer's job is then to do a draft outlining the content types, the fields associated with them, and any notes about them. You can see there are lots of columns here to fill out. We take a first crack at it, and then we coordinate with our developers on the team to review to help us make sure we got things right. Like sometimes I don't always know the correct field name, or there are lots of things in here. I'm not a developer, so I really rely on my development partners to guide in this. But at this point, I know a lot about the content. I've looked at a lot of the content, and I'm providing that initial structure. So this spreadsheet, I should say that Forum 1 has been using this content model spreadsheet for years. It was originally based off the content model template that Palantir created in, I think it was 2013. And over the years, we've adapted it for our team's needs and for our work. I should note that at the end, I have a link to that spreadsheet if you're not familiar with it. But in summary, the content model felt like the right place to try this, to try documenting these details to prevent all those questions coming up so much farther down the road. The other benefit of the content model is that it really is something that the team rallies around and unites them. When the content model is filled out, designers are referencing it to see what needs to be in the wireframes. Like if they're taking that content type and they're designing, it tells them what content needs to be on the page, what fields are there, what's required, what's not. And we then understand how the page needs to be flexible or adapt based on that. It informs what developers will build down the road. And it's also something that our project managers and our quality assurance team members are tracking and will reference as well. So it seemed to be like the right thing to edit and to unite us. Another thing that is important about our process, we've had great success in reviewing the content model beside the design together when we're reviewing them with the client. And we started doing this when reviewing both wireframes and designs because it really helps our team confirm we're doing the right thing, but also it helps our client have a much stronger understanding of how the content model connects with those pages and with those components. So this helps them understand how the design would work as a system rather than thinking of these as one-off separate pages. So at this point, we're like talking about tagging and how, you know, events are tagged by topic, for example. So we had great success there. So it seemed like, again, content model would be a great place for this to happen. I see a question in there. If you could have a copy of the slides. Absolutely. Right after this, I'll upload them to the Drupal GovCon website, and it'll be on the session detail page. If you follow me on LinkedIn or email me, I will also share a link as well. So we have the content model. With this past success, I then thought, okay, maybe we could do this same thing. We're doing it for content types. We're doing it for taxonomies. Maybe I could do this same thing for content views. So we created another tab in the spreadsheet and started outlining those different components. And for each component, we documented what content types would utilize that component and the field names and where the information pulls from. So you can kind of see here, if you look all the way over to the right, well, actually, let me tell you what this is. This is a featured, actually, sorry, I have a zoomed in version. So this is, you can see on the left, we have like featured content blocks or cards. Beloved cards. How many of you have card styles everywhere? And they're just slightly different. So here we've got a couple featured cards. But early on we said, what content types are going to need a featured card style? And so that's what you're seeing in the yellow there in the middle. A post type would, yes. An event would, yes. Resource, yes. Wiki, no. Profile, no. Okay, we'd also need to know what the field names were and where that information would then be pulled from. And what we see when we do this is that for events, we can use, we really tried hard to use the same layout, but they would have, you know, an additional field type with event type. And so we need to make sure to adapt for that. You can see here that the first one, style, applies for most of the content types. And then the second one with the guy in the field, the picture with the guy in the field, that's the one we would use if you feature an event. So the great thing about this is as we were doing this, we first started identifying components we would need. We were able to pull a list of existing components that were used on the site. We had a review of the content on the site and then identified additional components or components that needed to be redesigned. We took a stab at outlining the fields, pulling those over for what we wanted to show in this component specifically. And then we started wireframing and then eventually designing. So as the wireframe was done, we'd take a screenshot and we'd plop that in here and review with the team and make sure we weren't missing anything. And then as we moved into visual design and you start to see the color applied, the fonts, the look and feel, the images, as soon as those were ready, then we put those in here. So the really lovely part about it was that we were able to have a visual, which was great for our designers who are kind of visual thinkers and developers too, right? And front-end developers to reference alongside the content model information about where this is all pulling from. I see a couple of questions. I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about the results, and then we can come back to those questions. Oh, the one other thing I want to note here is that on the right side, you'll see notes. And so we also, as you can imagine, this was evolving through the design process. So it was our job as designers to keep this updated through the reviews we would have with our internal team. Big decisions that were made or big edits were documented there on the right to make sure that if somebody down the road was like, wait, this thing's now missing, or why did you do this? The really big decisions were in there, so it was easy to reference. That was another issue that we saw later in implementation is Sometimes decisions were made and then the whole team was like, it's 4 months later and you're like, wait, why did we do that? I don't remember. So the results. I went back after this process and talked to my team and asked what worked and what didn't. Like my first attempt, it worked and it was helpful. Okay, great. But it had even more benefits from that. The whole team could edit this document with or without me. This was really key when the visual designer was updating screenshots and when we handed this document over to the developers. And I also found that during development, the amount of time I was spending answering questions was reduced significantly because a lot of those common questions were answered in the content model now. And when I say time was reduced significantly, I think in general, I was spending about 6 hours a week answering questions, and that was reduced down to 1 hour a week, which is pretty amazing. I think the other benefit here was that I was feeling much more confident in my decisions and the answers to my questions because I'd done so much, the team, and me included, had done so much upfront thinking early on. And the clients also had fewer design questions during development because we talked through it in such detail with them. We eased them in, of course, because some folks aren't as comfortable in content models. But a lot of the questions were answered early on. And lastly, and most importantly, right, the team was happy. The developer was really pleased to have this outlined and to no longer have to guess on the direction or the decision and not have to wait for a designer necessarily for answers. Now, I will say that, you know, of course, there are still questions. That's bound to happen. We're human. We can't like think of every possible thing somebody on our team may ask or need. But the big improvement here is that those questions were asked earlier, and when questions were asked later in the process, the answers were quicker and we were much more prepared to answer. So I mentioned earlier those really common questions. The components that are nearly identical, that was really easy to spot once we had that content views tab in the spreadsheet, so we could catch that earlier and really ask ourselves a question then before anything got into development. We could say like, these are nearly identical, they are one field off, are we sure we can't combine them? So we were always referencing the content model and trying the best we could to prevent that earlier in the process. Where does this data for this component pull from? Outlined, it's in the content model, easy to check. Is this populated manually or dynamically? Again, in the content model. So summary is that there were many benefits to this. This is a process we continue to use. The other great part is that designers and developers started speaking the same language because they were both contributing to the content model spreadsheet. As I mentioned, there was a time savings, there were fewer questions, better documentation, which meant we could move much more efficiently. We also just had better review meetings with our internal team and with stakeholders because of that alignment, because designers and developers were totally in sync. I have a couple lessons learned and some resources to share. Okay, lessons learned. Tips for those of you who are like raring to go and ready to try this. The first one is to be open. In this case, if you're a designer, ask your developers what you need, what are the common questions they're always asking on projects. Now, there's a lot that could be answered here, right? And so my advice here is don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to do too much. We had 3 little questions we were trying to get answers to. And as you can see, there were a couple prototypes, a couple of things I tried to get to this solution. Like limit the amount of stuff you're gonna try and plan on like iterating over time. Don't try to solve it all at once. That can be unachievable and very difficult. Other advice, set up a cadence to review the content model. This just always takes longer than expected. So make sure you give yourself adequate time and have those. For us, it was really helpful to have those regular meetings to make sure we made it through both internally, but also with the client. As I mentioned, there's like that notes area on the right side. Make sure you note major questions in the content model. You will forget later. So make sure to make a note of it. Decide when you'll no longer keep the screenshots updated. Ooh, this is a tricky one. So getting those screenshots in there was fairly labor intensive. And in the design phase, they can get outdated quickly. They can also get really outdated once you move fully into like, and front-end development's complete. For us, we use Pattern Lab. And so this gets to number 6, but like decide your source of truth. Number 4 and number 6 go hand in hand. Decide when like on X date or when we get to X part of the project, we're not going to update the screenshots anymore. Number 5, make sure to set a handoff date. For us, like I mentioned, the UX designer drafts the content model, reviews it with the client, with the developer, you know, working hand in hand, but the owner then ownership is transferred to the developer. So set a date for that. This is very much like, who's got the ball? I thought you were doing that. So that just needs to be really crystal clear if you are doing that handoff. Number 6, define the source of truth for each phase and who maintains it. Eventually, for us, Jira and Pattern Lab were the source of truth. The content model serves as a great place to work those things out before we're fully in the thick of development. So this is another thing that it's really important to be on the same page with your team. And then finally, be flexible and adapt as needed. This was a learning process. We really did communicate that we're trying something new. This is a prototype. It may fail. It may do great. And as you can see, my first prototype kind of failed. So this requires everyone to sort of be flexible and know that we're just going to have some hiccups and we're going to have to sort it out. I have a couple of resources here. The first 2 are from Palantir that I mentioned, which is where our spreadsheet originated. I'd recommend you downloading that. It has all of the tabs. Like I said, we've just adapted it. And then if you're interested in learning more about content modeling and that approach, especially from a UX perspective, these links and the last one, there's a video and a book in there that are pretty helpful. Great. I think there are some questions in there. Again, thanks for sitting through the presentation. Feel free to contact me. I'd love to connect on LinkedIn. And one more shout out to my colleague, Julia Bradshaw, who contributed heavily to this talk. So I'll open the chat. How do you want to do this, Kevin? Do you want me to just start at the top with the questions and read them?
Sure. It looks like the first one is the result of a content audit the same as a content model?
No. For us, the content audit is more about what content we are keeping or removing or rewriting. For the content audit, we work with our clients on this to outline who owns that piece of content. We're often working on really giant sites with tens, if not like hundreds of thousands of pages. And so a really common issue is that once we come in for the redesign, the site may be overgrown. There's content that they didn't even realize was there anymore. Or, you know, John was supposed to like maintain this content. John's no longer at the company and we don't want to delete it because we're a little bit afraid, like maybe it was important. The content audit is the opportunity to review that, assign a new owner, and decide whether that needs to migrate and be part of the new site. The content model, to do the content model, we look at the content audit and we say, okay, here are the content types we're seeing, and let's make sure we have the correct fields. And so the common issue we see there is sometimes groups will have created, like I've seriously worked on a project where there are like 50 content types, and we're like, we're not going to need 50. Let's figure out what we're cutting. Sometimes groups will have content types with fields that they don't even use anymore. So the content model then identifies what are your content types, your fields. We also identify taxonomies. It's really like the cleaned up version after we do the inventory and audit. Long answer, but I know this is complicated stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Jason Weekly asked, can we get a copy of your template Excel file?
Yeah, so this is done in Google Docs, and oh, it's actually, I can share the immediate link for Palantir. They've had theirs open since 2013, and it's nearly identical. We've like beautified it a little bit. So that's the link I can share immediately with you.
Okay. Ralph Kohler asks, if you start with the inventory of an existing site, isn't there the danger that you keep a possible bias or blind spots and so forth? Let's see, life of the previous previous creators of the site brought in wouldn't be the creation of a domain model during the discovery phase be more beneficial beforehand, so it's decoupled from the current site and focus first on the stakeholders domain? That's a long question.
Yeah, I think I get the gist.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the question is like, isn't there a risk if you're not starting from scratch, if you're using the inventory to inform what you're designing and structuring? Yes, there is. There's also a risk because you have the same stakeholders potentially. In my experience, I have had many clients where we come in and we're like, okay, what do you got? What are we doing with all this stuff? And they're like, blow it up, blow it up. We don't want any of it. We're redoing everything. But that isn't true. I've learned that lesson several times. It's not true. It's not sustainable for the size of sites and projects that we're working on, which are quite large. It's not feasible for teams to recreate that content from scratch. It's not feasible for us to totally blow up what existed there before, because we're also working with humans. We're creatures of habit. We think about how we've done things in the past. There are workflows that are integrated deep into our brains about how we write content and upload it and maintain it. So yes, that bias comes along. However, in this case, Forum 1 comes in and we have a little bit more of a objective view, and we can think about how we're approaching this and how we've done it on other projects. And if they tell you to blow it up, my experience is that's not actually what's needed or what's going to happen. You're going to have to keep some of that, because unless you plan on having a much smaller and very, very different site, very different content.
Thank you. Dan Moriarty asks, who's making the spreadsheet? The designer?
Yes, so the UX designer starts the content model. We have the template we start from, and they do the first draft for the content types tab and the taxonomy tab. We do that draft because we also oversee the inventory and audit. And at that point in time, we are the project team member who knows the most about the content for the site. There are some teams that have specific content strategy folks, or maybe developers do that. At Forum 1, the UX designer creates the initial content model spreadsheet. We don't do it alone. We take the first pass, and then we work very closely with our developers to review it and to provide guidance and edit it. But that's kind of the background of how we do it and why.
Great. Kelsey Woody asks, if you're starting with an existing site, how do you manage requirements for views?
How do you manage requirements for views?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, maybe Kelsey, you could put some more detail in. I can go back to this slide. So this is what we outlined for view modes.
Courtney, hi. If I could ask you the question, sorry.
Yeah.
So I'm working with a government client, and they have a scope creep when it comes to, I'm the business analyst with a Scrum team of 5. So when it comes to managing requirements and kind of running into scope creep with specific content types and taxonomy, and you're going through this iteration where, the visual goes to the visual team, and then it goes to the developers, and then everyone starts over when the requirements change. Like, how do you manage that?
Yeah, great question. I have been there before as well. So we structure our projects. So if we're doing like a redesign, we structure our projects into these big stages: discover, design, and deliver. And in design, at the end, we have our content model, we have our wireframes, and then we also have components and pages designed. We essentially have a design system created. So it has like your basics of your font and type and spacing, and then it also has the components, and then it shows how those components fit together in pages. We are reviewing that stuff while we are creating them with our clients. And so when there is scope creep or when there are more requests, we are updating and adjusting as we go there. And we're also kind of consulting, right? So if we have a client who's like, no, we need a different content type for this, there's like part education that's happening and part like technical guidance and part design guidance. I know it's a hard question to answer because there's like very much a consulting aspect to how you manage scope and how you prevent that rework. But we involve the client along the way. And there's also a point where we say like, okay, these are signed off. If we do need to make edits for that, it comes after, XYZ is implemented, or it becomes phase 2. Also a challenging conversation to have depending on how that team has worked before, the expectations of the client. But we do try to set like a marker to say, if we want to stay efficient on this project, this has to be considered done so that we can get this development work done.
That totally answers my question. Thanks so much, Courtney.
Oh, good. hard question.
Jason asks, does this replace a scope document? And if it doesn't, how do you relate the content model document to numbered scope requirements or JIRA tickets?
Yeah, so we have, this is another tricky one because I think every company might do it a little bit differently. So we have our contract that will sometimes outline features and functions that we'll build, and sometimes there's a lot of detail and sometimes there's not much. It depends on the client. So we do also have, I think it's in our contracts, but we also talk about it a lot, that we're going to learn new things through the project, and we will adapt and adjust to meet the needs of the audiences and the client that we're designing for. So it's kind of like our scope document is evolving over time. So it starts with the contract, it kind of becomes the content model, and then, like I said, it can move into like JIRA tickets and Pattern Lab. If a question around scope comes up, we always go back to that contract, what was written in that contract. And if we learned something new and we needed to make an amendment, that is also documented. so that we can refer to that. Because the projects we work on can be 3 months, they can be like a year long. And so it's really easy to forget that stuff. So it's kind of like the scope is further defined the farther you get in the project. And there are many documents that outline the scope. I know that's kind of like a tricky answer, but it's kind of the truth. Like the contract is the source of truth, and then we further define what that means, how we're going to design it, how we're going to build it through the content model, Jira, Pattern Lab.
Okay, let's see. Dan Moriarty, did adding this process impact the overall budget, or did you simply pull hours from dev time and put more time into design documentation?
So it did add a little bit of hours to the design phase because we added a whole nother tab that we were defining. But it kind of came out in the wash because we weren't spending so much time later guessing or answering questions when we were in development. And it was actually pretty fast considering that we added a whole new tab, and we were already designing components. And so what it meant was that we were just adding those columns to define how the components, where the data was coming from. It did add a little bit of time to like keep the screenshots updated. But in the end, there was a time savings, and most of that is very noticeable because of the fewer questions developers had and the speed at which designers could answer those questions later.
Okay, we have time for, I think, one more question from Deborah. Within your content model, how do you identify fields that are shared between content types?
I don't know if I know the answer to that one. This may be a good one if there are developers on the line to answer that in chat. Sorry, Deborah, I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, so yeah, that pretty much wraps up the questions. Is there a link to your slides in the schedule, or?
It's not there yet. I will add it as soon as I'm after the Zoom, and I'll also share it on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Yeah. So, okay. Thank you very much, Courtney. That was wonderful.